Call to Action was started in 1976, and the purpose was to continue the work of Vatican II and all the liberal policies. We're a progressive movement, which is challenging Catholics to act for justice and to build an inclusive community. We support gender justice, the ordination of women, the dignity of all people, regardless of marital status, sexual orientation, and we also support inclusive liturgies. We support the poor. We do criminal justice reform work. We worked on the Child Victims Act and got that passed. We worked on HALT, and although it was passed, it's not being enforced. And this is another issue we're working on. We are also supporting the abolition of the death penalty, and we want dignity for workers and immigrants, and of course, care for the earth. So that's Call to Action in a nutshell. It's a national organization with chapters all over the country. Regarding this program, it is so important, not first because mass incarceration in and of itself is a travesty. But when it's becoming the main place, when prisons and jails are the main place for people who may have mental health issues or cognitive or intellectual issues, then it's, in my opinion, a crime. I've worked in mental health for over 40 years. And I have to tell you, I think when new medicines came out and deinstitutionalization, there were programs, there were halfway houses, there was some more support, in place, but gradually the funding for that cut off, particularly as each administration in New York, different governors supported different things. The drug courts were set up in 2009, and New York is one of the few states, I believe, that never added anything to that. We never added a mental health component or any other components. It also costs twice as much to keep someone in a prison than it would be to treat them either as an outpatient or in, treatment facilities. And it's something we really have to work on. That's why I think the Treatment Court Expansion Act needs to pass, although I think they changed the name of that. The most important thing I want to stress, and I think we need to get out to people, is that those with a mental illness or cognitive or intellectual diagnosis are more likely to be victims of crimes than criminals. And the criminalization of that, I think, is a travesty. So we have three amazing speakers. I'm going to introduce Art. Art McGrath is our president of this chapter, and he will be introducing our esteemed speakers. Take it away, Art.
Thank you, Ro. And thank you to everybody for taking the time during these stressful days, taking time out of your weekend to consider this complex, challenging issue of getting help for people with mental illness in our society with dignity, mercy, and justice. Just as a reminder, this session is being recorded and it will be on our YouTube channel and probably in some social media. So I just want to highlight quickly before I introduce the first speaker that in the mid-1800s, some people may know that Dorothea Dix was an advocate, a nurse who traveled around the country to bring attention to the mistreatment of the mentally ill, and she successfully advocated for a construction of mental hospitals in states throughout the United States. to provide what she called moral treatment of these people. And some of those people were in jail and other very bad situations. So it's quite an irony now that almost 200 years later, most of those mental hospitals have been closed, and many of the people suffering from mental illness are now incarcerated. And so today we're going to hear from an expert in this field, several experts, but the first one is going to talk. Dr. Slate is going to talk about the causes and alternatives to improve the situation. He was author of The Criminalization of Mental Illness. The third edition came out in 2021, I think. The title of the book is The Criminalization of Mental Illness Crisis and Opportunity for the Justice System. We will also hear from two practitioners in the justice system, a prosecutor, Heather Manley, and a public defender, Casey Dalporto. They will both share their experiences in this field and in the justice system and their ideas for improving and including proposals, especially related to mental health courts. So we're going to take questions at the end. So please feel free to enter your questions into the chat, and we will do those after all three individuals have spoken. And I wanted to highlight that in a very recent New York State Senate hearing on these issues, we heard some encouraging words from the highest levels of New York State courts. Judge Rowan Wilson, the Chief Justice of the State Court of Appeals, and Joseph Zayas, the Chief Administrative Judge of the state's unified court system, in a public hearing a few Fridays ago, according to a Spectrum News article, said the following: "There is a lot of evidence that treating people instead of incarcerating them provides better results for them, provides better results for all of us in terms of saving taxpayer dollars, but more importantly, keeping everybody safe," Judge Wilson said. The criminal justice system has become the de facto mental health system in the United States. That's like a horrible truth that's stated. I'm not sure if that's Dr. Slate's book or Vera Institute, because I probably didn't do so good on but Dr. Slate will tell us if that's from him. I'm really pleased to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Risdon Slate, author of The Criminalization of Mental Illness, third edition. He attained his Ph.D. at the Claremont Graduate School in California and is professor emeritus of criminology at Florida Southern College. He has prior work experience as a federal probation officer and at a death row prison. Dr. Slate's most recent book is entitled Resilience in the Storm: My Journey with Mental Illness. And you can see information about that book on risdonslate.com, his website. And he's lead author of the book I just mentioned, Criminalization of Mental Illness. He has served as a crisis intervention team trainer for criminal justice professionals and addressed them on processes for diverting persons with mental illness from the criminal justice system. He has personally experienced the interface of mental health and criminal justice, in addition to serving as a gubernatorial appointee on Florida's Mental Health and Substance Abuse Commission. Dr. Slate has testified before the U.S. House of Representatives Judiciary Committee, where his panel's testimony led to the first federal funding for mental health courts. Welcome, Dr. Risdon.
Thank you, sir. And I appreciate your call to action. I appreciate what you are doing, and thank you for having me with the other panelists. And I appreciate the people that are going to be listening out there and maybe watching this later on. Let me just start out by saying that Fred Markowitz was a researcher, and he found a predominance of private psychiatric hospital beds in cities to be significantly associated with increases in both arrest and crime rates. Now, why would that be? I mean, you get an abundance of private psychiatric hospital beds, and yet your arrest rates and your crime rates go up. How could that be? The key word there is private. And I'm sure that many of you remember the case with Kendra Webdale in New York City and Andrew Goldstein. One of the people testifying on my panel with me was Kim Webdale, the sister of Kendra Webdale. And she said the more she investigated what had happened to her sister, she said she realized it was a sick man that had done this. But she said it was also a sick system that had allowed it to happen. Why? Andrew Goldstein had actually checked himself in to a private psychiatric facility in New York City. But guess what? His insurance ran out. So what did they do? They pushed him out the door. And where did he end up? He ended up on a subway platform. He didn't know Kendra Webdale. He pushed her in front of the subway and killed her. So it is a sick system that is allowing this to happen, for sure. And you mentioned the funding of mental health. You know, back when John F. Kennedy was president, he actually signed a community mental health centers bill. But unfortunately, Kennedy was assassinated. We also had the Vietnam War we had to pay for. And there's this thing called NIMBY, not in my backyard. Citizens don't want mental health facilities in their backyard. So it never went anywhere. The money was appropriated but never allocated. So also, you know, I don't want to talk about Luigi Mangione, but there's another situation where private insurance certainly coming under scrutiny. And Luigi, by the way, they've raised over $1 million for his defense. And there's actually a play now called Luigi, by the way. I don't certainly advocate anybody killing someone, but anyway, he's called attention to a problem. And back to your comment, Art, if we look at patients in state mental hospitals at the beginning of the 20th century, the roughly 150,000 patients in state hospitals in the U.S. 1955, we hit our peak, 559,000 people in state hospitals in the U.S. From 1960 to 1980, it dropped to less than 100,000 in state hospital. Did we find a cure for mental illness? No, we didn't find a cure for mental illness. What happened was we got into deinstitutionalization. They were let out, they hit the streets, they came to the attention of criminal justice authorities, and then they were locked up in the criminal justice system. Today, it's estimated that there's probably 50,000 or less in state hospitals in the U.S. So what has happened is, and Art, by the way, I'm a professor, so if I start going overtime, signal me, okay? I know I have like 20 minutes or something like that.
You have 30 minutes. I'll give you a 5-minute warning.
Okay, great. Thank you. So what we see is that jails and prisons have indeed become the new psychiatric hospitals. As mental hospital populations go down, the number of prisoners increases. In fact, the three largest inpatient psychiatric facilities in the United States are jails. What are they? Rikers Island, New York City, LA County Jail, and also Cook County in Chicago. So, I'm going to focus on mental health courts because mental health courts is one way that we can hopefully get people out of the criminal justice system and link them to treatment. They practice something called therapeutic jurisprudence. What therapeutic jurisprudence does is it looks to the future. The traditional criminal justice system looks backward. They want to find fault, they want to assess blame, and they want to punish people. Mental health court instead is looking to the future, even with the idea that once this person leaves their contact with the criminal justice system, we're concerned about them and society so that they don't reoffend. And let me tell you about how the nation's first mental health court was founded in Broward County, Florida, Fort Lauderdale. There was a young man who had a brain injury, traumatic brain injury. He was in a supermarket in Florida, and he ran outside. He was hearing voices. He ran outside and he accidentally knocked an elderly lady down, and she hit the concrete. And then he was actually trying to help her put her groceries back in her bag. People saw him and they thought he was trying to rob her. That lady unfortunately died. He got charged with manslaughter. But his public defender said, you know what? I'm going to get a message to the grand jury. And he told the grand jury, he said, if you're going to indict my client, you need to indict the mental health and the criminal justice systems that have deprived him all along, and you need to go after them. So what did the grand jury do? Something grand juries can do. They conducted an investigation. They came back with a 155-page report saying that the mental health and criminal justice systems in Broward County, Florida, were broken. And as a result, the first mental health court in the U.S. started. And by the way, I just talked, Judge Ginger Lerner Wren is a friend of mine. I just talked to her because I was asking her, as you said, when I testified before Congress, our panel got federal funding for mental health courts. I was asking her, do we still have federal funding? And she said, well, SAMHSA is one place, Bureau of Justice Statistics, or Bureau of Justice Assistance, another place. But one of the problems is we're looking at significant Medicaid cuts, and Medicaid is a primary funder for mental health services in the U.S. So you have to be innovative. Some sheriffs have been innovative. What they've done is they've gone, in my county here in Florida, they've gone to a 1 cent sales tax that the citizenry actually voted in to help with people in their jail because of liability issues. So the other thing I wanted to say is that when you look at a mental health court, again, the focus is on the future. And if you go into a mental health court today, you walk into one, it's probably not going to be called a mental health court. They're trying to use less harsh or less stigmatizing language. They oftentimes will call them problem-solving courts. But when you go into one, you typically aren't going to see somebody in there on their first appearance. What you're going to see is a status hearing. They're coming back in to see if they're following the requirements of the court appropriately. And you tend to have, and there's no one ideal mental health court model, but you tend to have a judge who knows what they're doing. You tend to have prosecutor buy-in, public defender or defense buy-in. You have sometimes probation officers who can monitor the person as part of their a probation requirement, and you have clinicians. And all these people focus on therapeutic jurisprudence, moving forward so that we can properly treat people so that they don't come back again. So the key is having a judge that knows what they're doing. And I've got a friend of mine in Miami, Judge Steve Leichman. Steve has said, you know what? When a judge calls a meeting, people show up, believe it or not. If a clinician calls a meeting, nobody's going to show up. So the judge needs to be in charge and take hold of the situation. And I can tell you from my own experience, was indicated, I've had interaction with both the justice and the mental health systems. And I appreciated the lady there, is it Roe, that said that you all have a thing in there about abolishing the death penalty. Let me tell you, when I worked at the maximum security death row prison in Columbia, South Carolina, I worked there and we had not had an execution in the state of South Carolina because there was a moratorium on the death penalty as a result of the U.S. Supreme Court case Furman versus Georgia. So no execution in the past 20 years. Nobody on the warden's staff had ever experienced an execution. So what did the warden do? He flew to Florida. He witnessed an execution in Florida in the electric chair. He came back to Columbia, South Carolina. And what did we do? We rehearsed killing a person for 3 months. We would take a correctional officer about the size of the condemned inmate, march him to the electric chair, and strap him in and do everything but hit the juice. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't have too many people I know allow strap me into an electric chair. So that was his job to get strapped in. Now, I wasn't in the execution chamber for these executions. I was in the warden's office answering the phone. And so what happened was the first execution, one of the deputy wardens, the senior deputy warden there, had a heart attack after the execution. A lot of stress, but of course we were too macho to have counseling. Oh, forget that. And so then the second execution, a year later, the accomplice of the guy we had previously executed, a deputy warden had a stroke and never came back to work. Extremely stressful. The stress was palpable. And I'm looking at these, senior fellows, and I'm 25 years old, and I'm getting stressed out myself just watching them run around like chickens with their head cut off trying to deal with this issue. And so what happens is I start having trouble sleeping. So I go to my family practitioner. My family practitioner puts me on an antidepressant. And then I take a new job as a federal probation officer. I interned there in graduate school. So they put me to work and immediately gave me a caseload and pre-sentence investigations before I went to training. So what happens is it's Friday night before I'm to leave for training in Miami on Sunday. I have one more probationer to see. I went to see him, and he had been arrested earlier in the week, but he didn't tell me. First thing you're supposed to do is tell your probation officer you've been arrested. Well, he didn't. So I gave him 5 minutes or so to tell me he didn't. I finally asked him about it, and then he confronted me and said he was at my workplace. He owed me money, so I spit in his face. I said, "Look, I'm not here to debate whether the arrest was appropriate or not. I'm here wanting to know why you didn't tell me." So at that point, he said, "I'm going inside to call the police." So the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I'm like, is he going in to call the police or is he going in to get a gun? This is before cell phones. Went across the street, talked to a young couple there with a baby, and they let me use their phone. I called a federal probation officer for backup, and we called the police. 10 minutes later, I'm back over at the service station, and it's buzzing with cops. The only thing the police officer asked me was, "Did you ever unholster your revolver?" I said no, because I hadn't. So I don't know what happened to him, the probationer. I know what happened to me. I leave for Sunday morning on a plane to Miami while wife is coming with me. She's going to hang out by the pool and buy some clothes or whatever in Miami. And I end up there and I start drinking heavily. She goes to bed. I go down to the bar, start drinking heavily. I encountered a man to my right who I knew he wasn't my father, but I thought he was playing the role of my father. I thought it was on a film set, and it was a filming of Miami Vice. So I started interacting with him and saying things to him about how bad he treated my mother. And he's like, "Fool, I don't know who you are. I'm not your daddy," and whatever. So we were arguing. The hotel manager comes over and asks me to leave the facility. And so I do, but where am I going? I've never been to Miami before. So I left. I came back. They were taking the guy out that I was arguing with. The police were, but then they snatched me up and said, "The manager told you to leave. You're back here." And so they snatched me up and they take me to Jackson Memorial Hospital. I was placed in 4-point restraints. I was hospitalized and ultimately released if I agreed to go back to a hospital in Columbia, South Carolina. So I did. I went there, and in a 2-week span of time, I lost my job as a federal probation officer, and my wife divorced me. It took her a year for the divorce, but she left me while I was hospitalized. So I came home, back to my mother's in North Carolina, contemplating suicide, but I didn't. I'm glad I didn't. And what happened there was I had a mentor from undergraduate school who encouraged me. He said, "Look, man, you got a master's degree." He said, "Go teach at a community college." So I thought, really? And so I did. It didn't ask on the application if I was mentally ill. So I did. Started teaching at a community college, taught for about a year. And then my mentor encouraged me to apply to Ph.D. programs. I applied to 3, Claremont in California, I was accepted, and all three accepted me, but Claremont gave me a full ride and money for living expenses in California. So I went there, got my PhD. Then I go on to Maine after that, taught in Maine, and then I came to Florida. So here I am, all this time, I'm seeing psychiatrists behind the scenes for medication. Why? I am embarrassed. I am ashamed to have a mental illness. And so I see them, and what do? They prescribe me medication. My roommates in California didn't know I had a mental illness because the medication worked. Nobody in Maine knew. Only significant others knew I had a mental illness. So then I come to Florida, and in Florida, I came, taught a year in Florida, everything's fine. And then I encounter a psychiatrist. Saw me about 4 times, and he said, "You know what? I don't think you're mentally ill. I think you had a brief reactive psychosis to that possible shoot, no shoot event you encountered with that probation officer." I'm like, "Really?" He's like, "Yeah." And, I wanted to believe him because I was so ashamed of being tabbed with a mental illness. So he takes me off my medication. I end up having a manic episode. Second one, it was 8 years after the first one. End up this time in jail in Columbia, South Carolina. And you mentioned my book, Resilience in the Storm. One of the things that I have wondered or often been concerned about when somebody with mental illness writes a book, they often leave me lacking because they don't go into detail about their manic episodes and what they're experiencing. If you read that book, you're going to get wide open 2 manic episodes and what was going on. And by the way, the first time it was because I was on an antidepressant. Well, what Roger Deal, a psychiatrist in South Carolina, told me was the reason I had the second manic episode was because the doctor what did he say? He said that the general practitioner thought that I was depressed. He said, "No." He said, "You have bipolar disorder." And he said, prescribing a medication like an antidepressant is like pouring jet fuel on a fire in terms of the mania. And he said, "That's why you came to the attention of the authorities." But here's the deal. The authorities often don't know what to do. South Carolina, my wife was their new wife. They're telling them that I was bipolar, that I had a PhD in criminal justice, that I also had prior experience in the criminal justice system, in the prison down the street, and as a federal probation officer. And she said, "Please help him." What was their help for me? They took me directly to jail. And when they got me to jail, they didn't even bother telling the jailers that I was mentally ill. And so then I wound up before a magistrate who I found out later, he had his background in real estate. He didn't know anything about mental illness. So he sets my bail at $500. My arrest has been expunged, by the way. But in any event, what happens is I end up being initially attacked by a detainee in a holding cell. Then I end up attacked by detention officers. 5 detention officers hogtied me and dragged me to a strip cell. And in the strip cell, all they had was a hole for bodily functions, nothing else, no furniture, no bed. And in that strip cell, I started fishing through that hole. And what did I do? I put on excrement like war paint on my face. And I also came to the conclusion they had killed the guy that was in that strip cell because there was his broken wristband. So I'm panicking. About that time, the federal probation officer that I had worked with 8 years before got wind of me being in that jail. He came down, got me released to his custody. He took me to a hospital and I was treated. And this time, I decided to come out about my mental illness. And that's why I wrote the Criminalization of Mental Illness book, why I've written The Resilience in the Storm, why I testified before Congress. And so as a result, Mark Twain once said, the 2 most important days in your life are 1, the day you're born, and 2, the day you find out why. I know why I was born now. I have a mission, I have a goal to try to keep people out of the criminal justice system and get them linked to treatment. One last thing I'll say, then I'll shut up, is A modern interpretation of the word crisis in Mandarin Chinese is characterized by two symbols. One of the symbols for crisis is danger. The other symbol is opportunity. And if you think about it, in any crisis, there's definitely danger, but look for the opportunity. And that's what I've tried to do in my life, trying to capitalize on the opportunity and extricate myself from difficulty. I'll shut up for now. I said a lot.
Well, you did say a lot. And I just want to thank you for sharing all that personal information. I mean, what an amazing case for what the problem is, and how unusual to be able to get that in such detail from somebody who really understands how the system works and can put the words to the horrific manner in which you were treated. So
It's terrible.
thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thank you, Bart.
Yeah. So, going on to, really pleased to our next presenter. I'm really pleased to introduce Casey Dalporto, who I have watched in her amazing efforts of organizing support for reform in terms of the court system and mental health, and I'll let her talk about that. So she was the supervising attorney, or is the supervising attorney of the Policy and Community Engagement Unit at the New York County Defender Services. Before moving into criminal justice reform policy, she worked as a public defender and criminal immigration specialist in the Legal Aid Society's Bronx and Manhattan offices for nearly a decade. Casey is a graduate of Cardozo School of Law in New York University. Welcome, Casey.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. And again, thank you, Risdon, for sharing your story. It was really moving, and I applaud you for sharing it, because we do our best here to try to destigmatize mental illness and mental health, and taking medication, going to the hospital when you need to, and most importantly, part of the destigmatization, we hope, is going to one day help with decriminalizing people with mental illness. So that is what I've really devoted my career to in the last 4 or so years since I started moving into policy work. As Art said, I previously was a public defender in the Manhattan office and also in the Bronx. And I moved into policy after feeling extreme frustration with the way that the system handled, especially people who suffered from underlying mental health or substance use disorders. I literally remember being in a public defender in Manhattan and seeing the same people. I mean, Manhattan is a huge borough and there's thousands of people processed, and I'm just one public defender, but I would actually see the same people. Like I represented the same people over and over again. Or I would see my colleagues pick up the client that I had last year and be like, I just represented him. And it was it just struck me that we are fitting a square peg into a round hole in the criminal legal system. We are trying to address a systemic mental health crisis and a substance use disorder epidemic through a litigation proceeding, essentially, and one that's not at all geared, traditionally speaking, to looking beyond the charges and the rap sheet and the indictment and the evidence to figure out what's going on and prevent future harm. So at the time that I was practicing, we had just passed drug law reform in 2009, which created drug courts in every county. And so we had these drug courts that were new and fledgling, but still just buzzing with activity. And they were not perfect, and they still are not perfect. And there's a long way to go, and we hope to, address some of those issues in this legislation. But what struck me was that it was a lifeline to so many people who had substance use disorders. But we would hit a wall when people who had substance use disorders and mental health diagnoses would go through screenings because they would be rejected. They would say, we're so sorry, but this statute was only meant to address people with addiction issues and not mental health issues. And all of our partners, like our treatment providers and our service providers, are really only there to provide support for substance use disorder and maintaining sobriety and drug testing. And they're not really geared towards, helping someone address the root cause that might be driving that substance use disorder. And obviously since 2009, we've learned a lot about what drives substance use disorder and the way that it interplays with mental illness. And then we've also seen at the same time this huge surge in the population of people who become arrested in New York City specifically, and the rest of the state, and people who, irrespective of any drug use, are suffering from serious mental health disorders. At Rikers Island alone, when I first started about 4 years ago, it was just shy of 50% of the population at Rikers suffered from an underlying mental illness. Today, it's almost 60%. And what's more alarming is that the subcategory of those people, the people who suffer from what's called a serious mental illness, which is a clinical term that means, the diagnosis has caused severe impediment to their daily lives, their daily functioning. That went from about 10, 11% and about a decade ago to 21% 2 years ago. So, in the span of a decade or so, that proportion of people who are in crisis, in acute psychiatric distress, has doubled in our incarcerated population, our pretrial incarcerated population. And I see what it's like. I see the treatment that those clients receive when they're incarcerated, and it's absolutely abhorrent. It's really beneath the dignity of a nation as rich, and I shouldn't say high functioning, but a nation as wealthy and resource rich as ours. The conditions are absolutely decrepit and it's dysfunctional. And then beyond that, there's, for a long time, we had created what we had thought were like little bubbles of decency for people with the most acute mental health needs. And at Rikers Island, they created what are called PACE units, which are supposed to be units where clinical staff are on the floor and are able to help respond to crises. And then a year ago, our office helped facilitate this whistleblower coming forward who was one of those clinical workers. And she reported that there was virtually no clinical adherence at all in these units. And in fact, it was the opposite, that they were locking people in their cells for days, weeks, months, without denying them their medications, denying them showers, denying them access to their attorneys they called it deadlocking, until people had decompensated to the degree that they were, suicidal or, had committed such serious self-harm that they had to go to the hospital. So we have, it's no surprise then that when people are incarcerated, we're not solving the problem. We're not creating a better future for them or for any of us in the communities where they're going to eventually return to. And statistics bear this out. It's a lot of statistics show that people who have been incarcerated, even not with mental health issues, are in fact more likely to become rearrested after the incarceration than their counterparts who had never been incarcerated at all. And that is just, for obvious reasons. Incarceration, even putting aside the deadlocking and the inhumane conditions, it's incredibly traumatizing and destabilizing. And at the very least, it's it disconnects people from the connections and the social fabric or the social safety nets, whatever semblance of that they were receiving beforehand. So, and that's why we see this cycle. So as Risdon was saying we have dreamed of a different alternative, and in Manhattan and across the city, we have been experimenting with alternatives to incarceration, alternatives to the traditional legal process for a long time. And we've seen really amazing results. Not perfect. Nothing is perfect. And, as I mentioned, incarceration also does not lead to perfect results, but dramatically improved results. I mean, we're talking like cutting rearrest rates by half. That is routinely these programs that are studied. That's what they have proven to do almost across the board. And saving a lot of money. There's the unified court system, for example. They believe that for every dollar invested in these programs, the state sees $2.21 in savings, and that's just from like systems like costs, like the cost of not incarcerating the person and instead providing them treatment, the cost of reduced recidivism, so we're not seeing them again and again and again. And then when we also factor in the collateral costs, like the ability for this person to stay employed, stay in connection with their family, and be a supportive parent and or son or caregiver or whatever for their entire family, we see the estimated return on investment go up to $10 for every dollar invested. So, I mean, at a state, right now we're having some really tough conversations about the cost of healthcare and looming cuts to Medicaid, and also to a lot of people's health insurances are going to skyrocket probably in the next year. And so it's important to remember, like, this is critical to like fiscal responsibility and thinking smartly about how we are addressing people who become involved in the criminal legal system due to root causes. So anyway, we have mental health courts. We have many versions of them in the county in which I practice in Manhattan. We also have one in Brooklyn and the Bronx and Queens. And at this point, what we have a proof of concept. Like, we've done this, we know that it works, and we have buy-in from all the stakeholders. And what this legislation really hopes to achieve is to streamline all these programs, merge and find efficiencies where there's currently duplication. So merge a lot of these different disparate ad hoc courts, and also in the process treat people holistically so that you're not siloing people who have either a substance use disorder or a mental health disorder, or people who are like have a lower level charge versus a higher charge, like really trying to dissolve those barriers and bring everyone under the same model, and then at the same time treating each case as and holistically on a case-by-case basis as an individual, and then also expanding, because what we've seen is when drug law reform went into effect, we had a very similar system. We had these ad hoc drug courts that had already cropped up. And again, this is like the testament of the public defenders and the prosecutors and the judges and all of these different stakeholders coming together for the sake of creating a better way for everyone. It's really a testament to the goodwill of these stakeholders. But in order to really bring it up to scale, drug courts up to scale, we needed statewide legislation. We needed a governing statute, and we needed funding. Like, we needed the state to be on the hook to actually fund these courts, and so that there was stability, and also there was a lot more resources put into them. And so, yeah, that is really what we're hoping to achieve with this. Scale up what are already working in these pilot projects and have been now for, in Brooklyn, the mental health court is like 20 years old, and create more efficiencies and more uniformity within New York City and outside.
Good.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Casey. And our third and final presenter is Heather Manley. And Heather has asked that I make it clear that she is appearing as a citizen who is sharing her opinions based on her experience, and that she is not specifically speaking on behalf of the district attorney.
Thank you
Okay.
for that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that, Art.
Okay.
Um,
Let me just finish
oh,
your intro. Okay.
oh, sorry. That's right. I
I
jumped
know
the
that.
gun as usual.
I just wanted to get that in there.
Appreciate that.
So you're from the village, a village in central New York. You earned your BA from Union College in 1995, and your JD, Juris Doctor, from St. John's University in 2000. She was appointed as a assistant district attorney by then DA Robert Morgenthau, and assigned to the Office of Special Narcotics Prosecutor, where she worked for 6 years until she transferred to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, where she continued to practice as a trial attorney. Heather also worked in the investigation division, working on low-level financial crimes, and in the quality of life units, supervising junior attorneys and interns practicing in Midtown Community Court. In 2021, Heather focused solely on work in problem-solving courts, overseeing pre-arraignment diversion, and while also working on alternatives to incarceration and continuing to work in Midtown Community Court. In 2021, she was appointed as the Deputy Bureau Chief in the Pathways to Public Safety Division by DA Alvin Bragg, where she helps to identify and to move cases into problem-solving courts. Heather lives in Bay Ridge and is a proud parishioner of St. Francis Xavier and aspires to play more golf. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that. Art and Risdon, it was really nice to hear from you. I very much appreciate your perspective. And Casey, as I said before when we got on, it's good to see you again. Casey and I had cases against each other, I'm sure, back in the day. And I'm very honored to be here, and thanks CTA for this opportunity. I've been a prosecutor for 25 years, and by virtue of that, you might be surprised to hear me say I agree with a lot of what I've heard today. I'm going to quote something my boss said recently, and hope that she doesn't mind that I'm stealing her input. But she said, the criminal justice system holds the failures of all other systems. And specifically, as we're talking about today, clearly the mental health system as a healthcare system has failed in a way that has, failed in a way that makes it often cross my desk. And I, because I included in my background all that I had done, because when I started, the Rockefeller drug laws were still in existence. And so my practice in special narcotics court, we were sending people to state prison for multiple years for selling a dime bag of crack cocaine, and often, not always, but often to support their own drug habits. And so I include that to humbly say that I was part of the system when we didn't do it great and didn't do it well, and I've seen it evolve over the years. And so I hope that perspective helps to inform our practices now, because I've seen it evolve over the last 25 years. And back when I started, there was a drug court, and it wasn't codified at all. It was just a plan we had in place in Manhattan. And if you were arrested, your very first arrest for a drug sale, we gave you a drug program. Now, nobody asked if you used substances, Nobody asked if you had a substance use disorder. We just gave you a drug program. And so a lot of people who didn't struggle with substance use did great in that program because they tested negative because they don't use substances. They were only selling. And so when they graduated, they would turn around and sell again because we didn't identify the root of that problem. Now, in hindsight, maybe if we had gotten maybe some workforce development, or maybe some better housing, or any number of, more connect people to benefits, then perhaps people wouldn't feel the need to use drugs or sell drugs, excuse me. Um, that's what we did then, and we know better now, and we're doing better. But I add that just to give a little perspective of how I come to this work. And while I did want to make clear that I'm just Heather Manley, private citizen today, my work is I've learned this all through the Manhattan DA's office. And I first was introduced to problem solving courts in our Midtown Community Court, which is now the Midtown Community Justice Center. We had a program called the Overdose Avoidance and Recovery Court, where we introduced people to, that was the meet you where you are. It was very low level crimes. It was just a mere possession of low level drugs. And we got people the help they needed. If you were ready for harm reduction, we got you harm reduction. If you were ready for rehab, we put you in rehab. And the one thing that stood out to me from that time is a person who was utilizing those services said to me, it's such in the courtroom, I've been arrested over and over through the years. I always knew, these substances were going to kill me. I just never knew where to get help before. No one ever offered me help. And it's both a good thing and somewhat a sad thing that he had to be criminally justice involved for someone to offer him help. But I was pleased that I could say, look, we're here now. We're trying to help now. And the more I work in these courts, well, first I should back up and say that we have an entire division at our office now that's devoted to how can we get people steered into problem-solving courts as opposed to state prison. And we do that from a perspective of, is there a need that we can identify that has led you to be criminally justice involved? Can we help address that issue? And if we can, and then set you up for success, can we keep you from coming back to the system? And can we do that safely? Safely because not just we don't want people back in the community just to hurt other people. And also, I don't want to send someone to a facility or treatment where they're a danger to other people, because there's other people who are trying to work on themselves and trying to get and maintain sobriety, or maybe for the first time are receiving a serious mental illness diagnosis and are trying to manage being on medication, and those people need a safe place as well. So we approach it from a public safety perspective, and I approach it, and I think a lot of my colleagues do too, and I know they do, I represent the people of the state of the New York, but the people means everyone. It means all the citizens, and it means also the people who've been charged with crimes. And so on the days when people have completed our programs and I get to be at their graduations, which is always a really good day. In fact, I get to do one tomorrow. It's a really good way to start a Monday. I always say something like, I hope I don't see you again, unless you want to come back and help people, because I don't want your file to cross my desk. I don't want to see a rearrest, but come back and share your story. You're going to help someone someday. Come be a peer advisor. Come to the graduation. Because that's our goal, is to end recidivism. And so I can say that while and I remember when the judicial diversion legislation first was enacted to put people in drug courts, of course, our first thought was, ooh, you're forcing our hand. And I'm just being honest, that's what it felt like in the beginning. And now we've come to a way to understand it and have a better practice. And our office also recognized the need to treat mental health as well. And so we've funded a mental health track within our drug court calendar, because mental health and substance use are so often occurring disorders. And I know we're all using the term mental health, but where I see it happening is, of course, there are people with serious mental illness who are either undiagnosed or unmedicated, and bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder. But there's also people with trauma that they just haven't had help dealing with. And they've developed some maladaptive coping mechanisms that maybe lead them to crime, or they have PTSD, or they have complex PTSD. The people who have come through the foster system, even if everything goes great, it's not ideal. And so these are, all the people who I end up seeing in the criminal justice system. And so there are people who've lived terrible and hard lives, and they manage that with substances, and sometimes that leaves them to be criminal justice involved. And so our problem-solving courts right now address a layer of mental health through all of it, one way or another. In our drug courts, if there's a serious mental illness that's been identified, they can be treated on our mental health track. And we have an affirmative just a mental health court that treats people with a serious mental illness. And by definition, if we also need to, we can treat a substance use disorder there. What I think is one of the most frustrating and depressing parts of that is I think there's only two. I don't think that's changed. There are two rehabilitation places, rehab, like a drug rehab, that can treat someone with a serious mental illness. Two in all of Manhattan. And we need, I don't even know how many more we need, but we need a lot more than that. A week or so ago, I'm not often privy to what these numbers are, but a week or so ago, someone had been speaking anecdotally about trying to get into one of these rehabs, and the bed wait was 35 people long. And so that is, we're trying as best we can to identify people to go to these problem-solving courts. And as it exists now, we're overloading the system. And we're overloading it in terms of there's a wait for bedtimes. We don't have enough, we let clinical people do the assessment of who needs what, because what I always tell people, I'm just a lawyer. I don't know about this. I'd like to get you help, but it's not up to me what that help looks like. So we have clinicians who help us do that. We have social workers and case managers, and we don't have enough of them. And the turnover is really high, and the pay is terrible. I know I don't need to tell this panel here that the pay for social workers needs to be, 10 times what it is. And so the wait times, even just to get someone assessed to figure out what's going to happen next and what programming would be best for them, is, sometimes it's a couple weeks and sometimes it's 6 months. And we prioritize the people who are incarcerated because, well, in general, the faster you can get connected to services, the better everyone will be. But also the faster we can get you out of Rikers Island and into some sort of program is just better for everyone. But we're stuck with we're a little bit stuck with the services, or not the services. We just don't have the funding, and we don't have the humans to help make it work. And we're doing a lot more than we used to, but we would love to do more. I would love to see multiple judges who are doing mental health court. I would love to see multiple judges doing drug court. A lot of that's out of my control. And I'm happy to say, Risdon, I appreciated your perspective on the criminal justice system looking backward and punishing. And I'm hoping that what we're trying to do, at least what I'm trying to do, is look forward, because I can tell you that when we have people going through any of our problem-solving courts, before they complete and before we send them out into the world, we we'd like to see at least 90 days of sobriety because we want them to have, a good stability to move forward. We make sure they're working towards stable housing, either have a job or some sort of pro-social activity that will keep them busy and help them contribute and continue to work on their sobriety or help regain stability in their mental health life. We don't just send them out unsupported. At least we try not to. I can't speak for other jurisdictions, but I can tell you what we do in our jurisdiction. Because that's the best chance we have to get someone to not reoffend. And so I'm aware of the legislation that's been proposed, and I've read Judge Wilson's comments on that, and I'm happy to see that he supports it. And I think our office and I certainly would support more programming, but I'm concerned that there are some things in the legislation. I'm concerned that it would end up as an unfunded mandate. I'm concerned that we don't have the resources, as it is now, judicial diversion, that law codifies what goes into drug court, and the cases that go to mental health court and our other problem-solving court that our office created, an alternative to incarceration court, excuse me. The prosecutors have a fair amount of say about who gets to go there. Now, sometimes, the reason that my title was created is that so we could start sooner identifying cases that should go to those courts. But sometimes the defense attorneys will recommend or suggest it. And sometimes the judge will recommend or suggest it. But part of what seems to work well in all of those courts is that we're all working collaboratively to get someone over the finish line to see them set up for success. And so it helps to have the prosecutor on board, and it helps to have the judge on board. And some of my concern about the legislation that was proposed is taking away some of the ability to say no to some of those cases in the interest of public safety. And if judges are mandated by law to, no matter what, put a person in a problem-solving court without any of their own interpretation of how that should work, I'm just so worried we won't have the resources out there to handle all of that, even as much as we'd want to. And we also have some of this, I have some of the same concerns that Judge Wilson had about not having people enter pleas first. A lot of the people that we see who come in the criminal justice system occasionally, I mentioned that before, that
Hi, Rabia. I don't know what's happening. Is she frozen or?
Yeah, I suspect it's her internet.
and do a program to address mental health and substance use.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I saw that it said my internet was unstable. I was worried about what was happening.
Yeah, you froze for a bit there, but you're good.
Okay. So I was saying, having a prison sentence hang over someone's head, it gives them an extrinsic motivation to start, but eventually what we see are people developing the intrinsic motivation to get and stay sober or stay on their medication or address their underlying mental health conditions. And if legislation doesn't require a plea up front, I have some concerns about what happens if this doesn't work out, then depending on how much long, 2, 3, 4 years later, now we have crime victims who don't have finality, and we have crime victims that maybe we can't reach again. And now 4 years later, we have to put a case together and try a case. And so I support more programming. You know, I do it every day, and I really believe in this. But I also am concerned about having the resources, and I have some concerns about the unintended consequences of some of this. But it it but I by no means don't want anyone to take away that I don't believe in addressing these. Um, we have we had a misdemeanor mental health court that has now become a behavioral treatment court. We have lower level in the misdemeanor spaces. We have some treatment courts that help to get people connected to ACT teams, the wait teams to put those together, the alternative community treatment teams. Those wait times right now are very, very long. And I'm afraid if we overload that system, that will get worse. And so I it's important work. I'm honored to be party to do this as part of the DA's office. And like I said, it's one of the best things I get to do is see someone graduate. And we have a ceremony 4 times a year where we recognize past participants, and listening to people come share their stories in a more a casual environment that isn't just in the middle of a courtroom appearing before a judge in the true criminal justice. Listening to people share their stories, I know that they'll go on and help other people. And so I'm pleased to be doing this work. I wanted to wrap that up with something positive because I didn't mean to be all negative. I just wanted to raise from a prosecutor's perspective just some of the things we need to keep in mind as we're thinking about legislation going forward. And so thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and speak to you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Heather. So before we go to questions from the audience, do the panelists have questions or comments for each other?
I was going to say that I'm pleased to be on the panel with Casey and Heather, and I appreciate what you do. Also, I'm working on the 4th edition of the Criminalization of Mental Illness book, and Art, feel free to share my contact information with both Heather and Casey.
Okay.
I'd love to get some input from you all. In fact, in the 3rd edition, I actually have input from Judge Marcia Hirsch. She was over the Queens Mental Health Court, and she talked about the Queens Mental Health Court, and it's in the book. So I'm looking for practitioners out there that are doing things and having an impact, and just reach out to me. We can talk or whatever, and I'd love to hear from you. I appreciate what you're doing.
Any other comments or questions among you guys?
I can comment and respond briefly to some of the questions about resources, because this is our primary concern as well. I think this is something that we all are worried about. We have for decades divested from the behavioral health system, and so treatment providers are like running basically on a skeleton crew, and there's a ton of turnover, and housing is also a core shortage. And so, I mean, we see this as a budget bill in terms of policy. Like, we're not trying to pass this without funding. It is a budget bill. And then there's 2 aspects to the funding. There's court operations, which means like hiring people to do clinical assessments, or, you know, finding more funding to contract that out. And also hiring case managers, peers to staff the court, because in addition to the services that are provided in the community, a really core, the linchpin of these programs are the staff in the court that are helping people navigate, making sure that we don't overload one program, and that we like spread out all the resources and fit people with the right places. So that part is easy. I mean, it's not easy, like obviously it's all very expensive. But in terms of like the state budget, the unified court system expects that that will cost $51.4 million. Again, that's a very large amount of money, but it's actually quite feasible to achieve. We're not getting any pushback from the judiciary or the legislature or the executive about that. The bigger question is, how are we going to make sure that the resources are there? And it's been really hard to even estimate what the cost would be, because we're projecting, of course, like we don't know actually how many people are going to apply. We kind of have a roadmap because we've been doing a ton of research on what happened when drug law reform went into effect, what happened when we created statutory diversion in 2009. And at that time, it was a very similar landscape. And also, I should say, at the time, reading through the transcripts of the hearing leading up to it and all the op-eds that were written around that time, everyone's biggest question was resources. Everyone said that was like the number one criticism. We don't have enough resources to pull this off. And so we have a sense of like what that influx was like in the very early years and how much the providers did need. They got $80 million from the legislature, and it went to the providers that were already up and running mostly. And that allowed them some breathing room to just like immediately expand capacity. But even like a year and a half out, they were like, we're overloaded, like we need more money. And so eventually you saw this like a more robust treatment landscape for people with substance use disorders, at least. Obviously, it's still not there, but it's in my perspective, I think that it's much more fleshed out than mental health providers or people with dual diagnoses. So that gives me some optimism that like we've done this before and we can do it again. And also again, this is a really tough year for anything related to the budget because we have so much uncertainty from the federal level. But I think it's a good sign that when we tell stakeholders like, the Senate, the Assembly, the executive, like this is in the ballpark of what it's going to cost, no one is balking. They're like taking it very seriously, like, yeah, well, that's about what we expected. And when you compare it to, again, like these other massive institutions, like how much we pay for prisons and jails, like it is like a much more manageable amount of money. I will also say that there's some other services that are coming through the pipeline right now. Like the governor, I think it was 3 years ago now, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, made this $1 billion pledge to invest in mental health in New York State. Most of that is going to housing, building out housing. And so that's taking a long time to like work its way through. It takes a long time to build new housing or, repurpose housing. But there are a lot new ACT teams coming online and some other like behavioral health services that are starting to come online now. But yeah, I do agree that that weighs very heavy on all of our minds. The lack of resources. And we made an amendment to the bill that will give more flexibility to different jurisdictions who are facing like a huge scarcity of resources, which allows judges to reject people outright if they find that there's not enough, there aren't resources that are available currently to address the person's needs. Of course, that is like this heartbreaking concession because it means that they're going to probably end up going through the traditional channels and, go through jail, prison, probation, whatever it is. But the silver lining is that it won't overwhelm. We think that like Manhattan right now is probably going to say like, we can't handle any more cases right now. And that would be an option under the statute. And that there would be a recording of that. So they would have to mark that and tabulate that. And at the end of the year, provide that to the legislature and say, like, this is how many people could have been diverted who were not, because you're not funding our treatment landscape sufficiently.
Okay, so let's try to squeeze in before we finish some of the questions from the audience. Pat asks, if Manhattan doesn't have the resources now, how will the more rural counties be able to function? What's being done to increase treatment?
Well, I did just allude to this, but there is a ton of focus on rural counties right now through the Office of Mental Health and also the Office of Addiction. OASIS, they just changed their name, so I always get this wrong. The Office of Addiction Services and Supports. So OMH is the Office of Mental Health, and they handle mental health services funded by the state. They do licensing, and they do direct funding to a lot of the community-based providers. And then OASIS provides the same for substance use disorder treatment services. By the way, just to point out, or just to circle back to Heather's complaint that like there's not enough dual diagnoses, like services that address dual diagnoses. This is why, because the state has organized all of its like funding and licensing apparatus into these two categories. And so you are either an OMH licensed facility or an OASIS licensed facility, and an OMH funded facility, OASIS funded facility, and they cannot bring themselves together to just create a better umbrella for that. And it is actually something we've been involved as well in trying to break down that barrier. There's a push to merge the agencies. But yes, so yeah, that's a serious problem.
Yeah.
But OASIS is they're both working from separate funding streams to try to build out services in rural counties. The OMH is focusing from the governor's billion-dollar investment, and then OASIS has the opioid lockbox funds, and both of them, their mandate is like focus on rural areas.
Okay, another question. You've done a fantastic job of identifying the horrific problems. The question I'm left with is, what is the reason this continues? What is benefiting from the system continuing? The cost is incredible, and I think there's a related thing, is who or what is benefiting from the system running the way it does? I know that's
Well, it's easier to just stick somebody in jail than to try to treat them or try to help them. I
right.
mean, and law enforcement oftentimes will get frustrated if they take somebody to a civil facility, psychiatric unit, because the next thing you know, the person may be out. They now don't meet the criteria for being placed in the facility, and the cops will come across them again, and now they're like, I'm not taking them back there, I'm going to take them to jail. So it's much easier for the criminal justice side, and that's why we need to have better interaction between criminal justice and mental health. And that's what a mental health court can do, is establishes that. And the other thing I'll say is, if you ever go to a mental health court proceeding, you're probably going to see a status hearing, but I've seen them where people needed to be civilly committed. And you talk about the humanity and the dignity people can be treated with. I've seen a judge come down from the bench and talk to the person like they're a human being, even though they're going to have to be civilly committed. So it's a very positive atmosphere, and you all have mentioned certificates and things like that. It's very positive emphasis in a mental health court. And for some of these people, they've maybe never had anything positive happen to them.
Any Anything else before we stop? I think we're almost at the end. Anybody have any of the panelists with any final comments? Well, then
Wait, can I say one more thing? Sorry, I was just
Sure.
formulating the thought. I forgot to plug this, which is um, supportive housing or housing in general of any kind is, in my view, the biggest criteria, because you can't work on your substance use disorder or any of your mental health issues if from a shelter system or from the street. And so if we got to put resources somewhere, I mean, let's start with housing as well and supportive housing. If we could have more of that, that would help too. I meant to say that before.
One way to do it is to get the citizenry perhaps to vote on a ballot initiative for maybe a 1 cent increase in taxes and have that money earmarked for housing. They've done that here in Polk County, Florida.
Really? Huh. If it can happen in Florida.
Yeah, you better believe it, Casey. Yeah. Gosh. It wasn't at the state level,
Okay.
at the county level.
any final comments? Anyone else? Well, I just want to thank all the panelists, Heather and Risdon and Casey, for all of the wonderful work and the presentation today. It was really, really informative, and I think we're going to have some really good material to get the word out
Thank you, Art.
communities. Yep.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you all.
Appreciate what you all are doing.
Thank
Yes.
you. All right, and thanks to the audience, everyone who participated, and we will be showing parts of this video at our annual meeting next month, and discussing it further.
Good.
So,
Can we get a copy of the video at some point?
absolutely, yeah, we can
Okay.
do that. Yeah.
Okay, good.
All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, and hope everybody has a great rest of the weekend. What's left of it, right?
You too.
Before we start again. Okay. Take care, everyone.